The God of the Old Testament is the creator of everything. In the book of Isaiah, we read that God is responsible for all things that happen, both good and bad. I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. And in case anyone thinks about raising any objections to this arrangement, woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherd strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, What makest thou, all thy work? He hath no hands. This lesson is brought home in the book of Job. The story is well known. God and Satan have a bet that Satan can turn one of God's biggest fans, Job, against him. God lets Satan do his worst, and Job pretty much loses nearly everything: family, property, his wealth and his health. He rails against God and argues with some of his mates who have turned up to cheer him up as to whether God really is a good bloke or not. Eventually, God himself shows up and lets Job know that he is God and he decides what goes, and mere mortals like Job just have to put up with it. He then restores all Job's stuff and Job lives happily ever after. The God of the Old Testament then is pretty much the decider of what happens to people, and people don't get a say in it. The ancient Hebrew God made everything happen, including ourselves, and that was simply that. The God of the New Testament goes further and not only directs everything that happens, he knows in advance which people he's going to save from sin and death and which he isn't, because he made them that way. In the book of Romans there's this: And we know that all things work together for the good of them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified, and whom he justified, them he also glorified. And for the children not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth. In the book of Ephesians we've got, having predestinated us into the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. And in John there's, Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you, and ordained you, that ye should go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatsoever ye ask of the Father in my name, he may give it you. It was stuff like that that got Augustine of Hippo to think that God ordained everything, including whether anyone got to go to heaven or not, from the very beginning, and that what anyone did or not had nothing to do with it. Ideas that were later taken up by Calvin after his jump from Catholicism to Protestantism. While the Catholics still prefer to think that God lets you make the call, that as long as you're on his side you'll go to heaven, the Calvinist branch of the Reformation stuck with the idea that there's those who are chosen and those who aren't. The idea is called predestination, which is theistic determinism. All of this gives an impression of seeing God's will as what it is that makes everything happen, including what we humans think, feel and do. It isn't that he's reading our minds all the time, it's that he already knows what's there because he made it in the first place, and all based on a plan of his from before creation of everything. No matter what we do or believe, it's God's will that's the real reality. Now, a millennia or so after these books from the Bible were first written, the philosopher Schopenhauer came up with the idea of what he called the will. It's all a bit detailed, but basically what he did was take Kant's notion of the thing in itself, which is the idea that any object we experience we don't fully experience, because we can't fully detect every essential element of that object due to the limits of our senses and cognitions. From that, Schopenhauer decided, based as much on ancient Indian philosophy as his own reasoning, that the thing in itself was not the unseen, unknown multiplicities of various objects, but a whole, a totality, which he called the will, on account of him seeing it as a constant striving, that is, willing into being. In the course of this striving, the will made representations, which are what we perceive as individual things. Anything from the smallest microparticle to the largest stars in the universe are basically representations of the will, because our own sense perceptions only perceive those representations and not the will itself. In the introduction to his On the Will in Nature, he states, This will, far from being inseparable from, and even a mere result of, knowledge, differs radically and entirely from, and is quite independent of, knowledge, which is secondary and of later origin, and can consequently subsist and manifest itself without knowing, a thing which actually takes place throughout the whole of nature, from the animal kingdom downwards. This will, being the one and only thing in itself, the sole truly real, primary metaphysical thing in a world which everything else is only phenomenon, i.e. mere representation, gives all things, whatever they may be, the power to exist and to act, that accordingly not only the voluntary actions of animals, but organic mechanism, nay, even the shape and quality of their living body, the vegetation of plants, and finally, even in inorganic nature, crystallization, and in general every primary force which manifests itself in physical and chemical phenomena, not excepting gravity. That all this, I say, is itself, i.e. independently a phenomenon, which only means independently of our brain and its representations, is absolutely identical with the will we find within us and know as intimately as we can know anything. This of course means that all our own thought and actions are the result of the same total force, the will. The impulse to think and act comes first from the will, and our conscious brain merely follows, just as the will makes everything else happen. In his main work, Word as Will and Representation, he writes, "The disturbing influence of the will on the intellect, as all these phenomena prove, and, on the other hand, the intellect's frailty and feebleness, by virtue of which it is incapable of operating correctly whenever the will is in any way set in motion, gives us yet another proof that the will is the radical part of our real nature and acts with original force, whereas the intellect, as something adventitious and in many ways conditioned, can only act in a secondary and conditional manner." So, for Schopenhauer, it was the will that determined what we think and did, and therefore any actions we take and therefore any outcomes of those actions. The will, in fact, is behind everything, the real source of everything, our own wills included. Schopenhauer influenced a lot of artists, as we know, and one of them was the writer Henry Melville, whose best-known book, Moby Dick, can be seen allegorically as a depiction of the striving of the will in cosmic, almost biblical terms, but within the literary context of a whale hunt in 1820. Ahab, captain of the whaling ship the Pequod, has a number of dialogues that suggest Schopenhauer's will. "All visible objects, man, are but as pasteboard masks, but in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there some unknown but still reasoning things puts forth the mouldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, shoved near me. Sometimes I think there's naught beyond, but 'tis enough. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength, with an unscrutable malice sinewing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate, and be the white whale agent or the white whale principle, I will wreak that hate upon him." And? What is it? What nameless, inscrutable, unearthly thing is it? What cozening hidden lord and master and cruel, remorseless emperor commands me, that against all natural lovings and longings I so keep pushing and crowding and jamming myself on all the time, recklessly making me ready to do what in my own proper natural heart I durst not so much as dare? Is Ahab Ahab? Is it I, God, or who, that lifts this arm? But if the great sun move not of himself, but is as an errand boy in heaven, nor one single star can revolve, but by some invisible power, how then can this one small heart beat, this one small brain think thoughts, unless God does that beating, does that thinking, does that living, and not I? By heaven, man, we are turned round and round in this world like yonder windlass, and fate is the handspike, and all the time, lo, that smiling sky, and this unsounded sea. In this way, Melville almost merges Schopenhauer's will with the predestinating God of the Bible. Through the character of Ahab, Melville asks the question, what is it that makes us act, even if it seems to us that our actions are not in accord with our own individual wills and reasoning? It's interesting that this suggests something like one's own free will, in that Ahab can at least notice what he is doing from some subjective perspective, enough to ask questions of it, and yet he admits his strong desire to catch and kill Moby Dick, and that desire from his desire to somehow attain some kind of cosmic truth behind what he sees are mere pasteboard masks. It should be noted that in both these cases, Ahab is in conversation with Starbuck, his second in command, who is alarmed to see his captain basically going bonkers and imperiling the entire ship, the Pequod, on a doomed mission to avenge himself against the great whale Moby Dick. Starbuck plays Ahab's rational foil, trying to convince him back to sanity, but failing all the time. Just as Ahab fails in his task to kill Moby Dick, Starbuck fails in his task to restore Ahab to his senses. In both cases, they are up against something that is stronger and completely without any apparent human understanding. Ahab dared to take on the will, just as Job dared to question God, And while Job repented and got more than his original wealth and status back from a God that appears sympathetic while remaining inflexible, Ahab pays for his pride and blasphemy to a more selfish and uncaring force, one that, unlike God, doesn't have any real interest in the benefit or not of the human race. It certainly, unlike God, doesn't pretend to. Ahab senses this, and it's that incenses him, but like Job, he can only shake his fist at the sky, which continues to stare down uncaringly at his ruin and humiliation. Both the omnipotence and will of God, and Schopenhauer's will, can both be said to be part of the overall philosophical discussion about determinism. Over the centuries, various philosophers have rabbited on about whether we have free will or not, if so in what capacity, if not what the hell are we doing, and so on. It's all a bit unresolved. But recently, neuroscience has made discoveries that suggest that at least in some cases, decisions are made subconsciously first and then consciously recognised afterwards. According to an article on the Conversation website called "We Make Thousands of Unconscious Decisions Every Day," there are two forces that govern our behaviour: intention and habit. In simple terms, our brain has dual processing systems, sort of like a computer with two processors. Performing a behaviour for the first time requires intention, attention and planning, even if the plans are made only moments before the action is performed. This happens in our prefrontal cortex. More than any other part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for making deliberate and logical decisions. It's the key to reasoning, problem solving, comprehension, impulse control and perseverance. It affects behaviour via goal-driven decisions. For example, you use your reflective system, intention, to make yourself go to bed on time because sleep is important, or to move your body because you'll feel great afterwards. When you are learning a new skill or acquiring new knowledge, you will draw heavily on the reflective brain system to form new memory connections in the brain. This system requires mental energy and effort. On the other hand, your impulsive, habit system is in your brain's basal ganglia, which plays a key role in the development of emotions, memories and pattern recognition. It's impetuous, spontaneous and pleasure-seeking. For example, your impulsive system might influence you to pick up a greasy takeaway on the way home from a hard day at work, even though there's a home-cooked meal waiting for you. Or it might prompt you to spontaneously buy a new expensive television. This system requires no energy or cognitive effort, as it operates reflexively, subconsciously and automatically. So basically, we are constantly doing things that don't require our consciousness to focus completely on them. Knowing how to use the device you're listening to right now means any number of mental actions that you don't need to have in the front of your mind while doing them. And these mental actions are part of the decision-making process of everything we do. In short, we're as directed by unconscious mental activity as conscious, and often more so. Now that in itself doesn't discount free will per se, but it does show that even with free will, our brain does not operate all the time based on our conscious, rational and willful decision making. How many times do we do things we only know later are stupid, or even at the time, as if our personal will is conflicted and the only decision making turns out to be spontaneous and intuitive? While I'm personally a determinist, I couldn't tell you what kind, soft, hard, chewy or crunchy. All I know, in my own lay subjective way, is that there is cause and effect, and that the universe as we perceive it with our own feeble senses and limited cognition had a cause, although what and how we'll never know, and that since then it's all been effect after effect, and here we are today confused as fuck about it. Like Job, we can curse our fate only to submit to it, or like Ahab, we can try and fight it and lose. But fate is still fate, and it doesn't have to be written in the book of life by some ultimate and unknowable creator, or guided by some mindless force constantly striving and constantly failing to appease itself. These things are metaphors, and sometimes useful ones, although you wouldn't want to take them literally. Stripping away the metaphors, we find very little we can actually monitor and understand, so while we know what isn't literally true, we're still in the dark about what is going on, which is probably where we're going to stay. Science can only prove so much, demonstrate so many facts, but it's our own constant striving for explanation, for a realised whole of existence, final explanation of what is, that gets us filling the gaps with gods, no matter what we call them and how we describe them. And if determinism is true, then that's our fate, to make up gods to plug up gaps, even though the gaps will always be too big and we'll never have enough gods to fill them. And if that is so, so be it.